Welcome, weary traveler, to this quiet corner of the night where ancient stories whisper through the darkness. Tonight, we're not diving into fairy tales or gentle bedtime stories. No, we're venturing into something far more intense, far more unforgiving. We're stepping into the Old Testament, where survival wasn't a given and comfort was a luxury most couldn't afford. Before we begin this journey into biblical antiquity, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. What city, what country, what time zone has brought you here to explore these ancient tales? Drop a comment and let me know. There's something oddly comforting about knowing we're all gathered here together, separated by miles but united by curiosity about humanity's oldest stories. If this kind of deep dive into history helps you unwind, feel free to subscribe. But only if these explorations truly bring you peace. We'll be traveling through many more forgotten worlds together. Now, settle in. Dim the lights, let your breathing slow, and prepare yourself for a world where angels weren't gentle beings with harps, but terrifying messengers that made grown men fall face first into the dirt. Where plagues weren't metaphors but very real disasters that could wipe out entire civilizations overnight. Where the phrase fear of God wasn't just a religious expression, but a survival instinct. The Old Testament isn't the sanitized Sunday school version many of us grew up with. It's raw, it's brutal, and it's absolutely unforgiving. It's a world where you could be turned into a pillar of salt for simply looking over your shoulder. Where the ground could open up and swallow entire families, where bears could maul children for making fun of a prophet's bald head. So let's be honest about what we're dealing with here. This isn't about faith or theology. This is about survival, pure and simple. If you were dropped into the ancient Near East during biblical times, would you last a single day? Would you know which foods were clean and which were abominations? Would you understand the intricate social hierarchies that could mean the difference between life and death? Would you recognize the signs that God was about to unleash his wrath upon your city? The answer, quite frankly, is probably not. Because the Old Testament world was designed to test humanity at every turn, to separate the faithful from the faithless, the obedient from the rebellious. And the consequences of getting it wrong weren't detention or a stern talking to. They were immediate, devastating, and often eternal. Let's start with something that sounds deceptively simple: the rules. You think modern life is complicated with its tax codes and traffic laws? Try navigating the 613 commandments of the Torah. That's right, 613 specific rules governing everything from what you could eat to how you could weave your clothing. And these weren't suggestions. These were divine commandments, backed by the ultimate authority, with punishments that made medieval justice look merciful. Take the dietary laws, for instance. Leviticus 11 lays out in excruciating detail what you could and couldn't consume. No pork, obviously, no shellfish, no rabbits, despite them seeming perfectly innocent, no birds of prey, no insects except for locusts, grasshoppers, and crickets, which were apparently fine. The text is very specific about cloven hooves and cud chewing, about fins and scales, about which birds were acceptable and which were detestable. But here's where it gets tricky. It wasn't just about avoiding certain animals. It was about preparation, about separation, about ritual purity. You couldn't cook a young goat in its mother's milk. You couldn't eat the fat of cattle, sheep, or goats. You had to drain the blood from any meat you consumed because the life was in the blood, and the blood belonged to God. Imagine being a time traveler, dropped into ancient Israel, desperately hungry after a long journey. You see a rabbit hopping by. Looks harmless enough, right? Wrong. Eat that rabbit, and you've just violated God's law. You've made yourself ritually unclean. You've committed an abomination, and in the Old Testament, abominations had consequences. Or let's say you're invited to a feast. The host serves you a delicious stew. It smells wonderful, tastes even better. Only later do you discover it contained pork fat. Congratulations, you've just defiled yourself. And in a world where ritual purity was everything, where being unclean could exclude you from worship, from community, from the very presence of God, this wasn't just a dietary mistake, it was a spiritual catastrophe. But the food laws were just the beginning. The social laws were even more complex and far more dangerous. Take the concept of the Sabbath. Sounds peaceful, right? A day of rest, a break from the grinding work of ancient life. But the Sabbath wasn't a suggestion, it was a commandment, and breaking it was a capital offense. Exodus 31:14 states it plainly. You shall keep the Sabbath, because it is holy for you. Everyone who profanes it shall surely be put to death. For whoever does any work on it, that person shall be cut off from among his people. Death, for working on the wrong day, not imprisonment, not a fine, not community service. Death. And what constituted work? The rabbis eventually identified 39 categories of prohibited activities, but in the biblical period, the boundaries were often unclear. Could you light a fire? Could you prepare food? Could you walk too far? Could you carry something from one place to another? Get it wrong, and you weren't just breaking a rule. You were committing a sin punishable by death. Numbers 15 tells us the story of a man found gathering sticks on the Sabbath. Just gathering sticks. Maybe he was cold. Maybe his family needed fuel for cooking. Maybe he simply forgot what day it was. The text doesn't tell us his motivation, only his fate. Moses inquired of the Lord, and the Lord's response was swift and final. The man shall surely be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones outside the camp. And they did. Think about that for a moment. A man died for picking up sticks on the wrong day. His entire community participated in his execution. His crime, forgetting the calendar. His punishment, being crushed to death by rocks thrown by his neighbors, his friends, possibly his own family members. This is the world we're talking about. A world where the rules weren't just strict, they were lethal. Where mercy was rare and justice was swift. Where the difference between life and death could be as simple as which day you chose to do your chores. But let's say you somehow managed to memorize all 613 commandments. Let's say you were the perfect law-abiding citizen, never eating the wrong food, never working on the wrong day, never wearing the wrong fabric. You still wouldn't be safe. Because in the Old Testament, God's wrath wasn't reserved for individual lawbreakers. It was collective. It was environmental. It was apocalyptic. Consider the flood. The entire human race, save for one family, wiped out because humanity had become corrupt. Genesis 6:5 tells us that the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. The solution? Start over. Drown everyone except Noah and his family, every man, woman, and child on earth, every baby, every pregnant mother, every person who might have been trying to live a good life but happened to be born into a wicked generation. The flood wasn't a targeted strike against specific evildoers. It was total annihilation. And if you had been alive then, your personal righteousness wouldn't have saved you unless you happened to be one of the 8 people God chose to preserve. Your fate wouldn't have been determined by your actions, but by your timing. By the cosmic bad luck of being born into the wrong era. Or consider Sodom and Gomorrah. 2 entire cities obliterated by fire and brimstone because of their wickedness. But what exactly was their sin? The text mentions pride, excess food, and prosperous ease while neglecting the poor and needy. It mentions abominations, but it doesn't provide a detailed legal brief. It doesn't offer a precise definition of what crossed the line from sinful to annihilation-worthy. Abraham negotiated with God, trying to save the cities. Would God spare them for 50 righteous people? Yes. 45? Yes. 40? Yes. He worked his way down to 10, just 10 righteous people, and God would spare the entire population. But 10 righteous people couldn't be found. So fire rained from heaven, and the cities were destroyed utterly. Lot's wife, fleeing the destruction, made the mistake of looking back. Just looking back. Maybe she was worried about friends left behind. Maybe she was curious about the destruction. Maybe she was simply human, drawn to witness the supernatural devastation. It didn't matter. She was turned into a pillar of salt. Instantly. Permanently. For the crime of curiosity. This is what we're dealing with. A world where entire populations could be erased for collective sin. Where individual righteousness was no guarantee of survival. Where the wrong glance at the wrong moment could be your last act as a human being. And then there were the plagues. 10 of them, unleashed upon Egypt because Pharaoh refused to let the Israelites go. But think about who actually suffered. It wasn't just Pharaoh and his court. It was every Egyptian. The water turned to blood, affecting everyone who needed to drink. The frogs invaded every home, every bedroom, every kneading bowl. The gnats tormented every person and animal. The flies swarmed everywhere. The livestock died. The boils afflicted everyone. The hail destroyed crops and killed anyone caught outside. The locusts ate what little the hail had left. The darkness was so thick it could be felt, trapping people in their homes. And finally, the death of the firstborn. Every firstborn son, from the house of Pharaoh to the house of the prisoner in the dungeon, from the firstborn of livestock to the firstborn of humans. Imagine being an ordinary Egyptian during this time. You had no say in Pharaoh's policies. You didn't enslave the Israelites. You might have even sympathized with their plight, but you suffered anyway. Your water was undrinkable. Your home was invaded by frogs. Your body was covered in boils. Your crops were destroyed. Your livestock died. And if you were a firstborn son, or if you had a firstborn son, the angel of death came for you. The only protection was the blood of a lamb painted on your doorpost. But you would have had to know about this protection. You would have had to understand the ritual. You would have had to have access to a lamb and the knowledge to apply its blood correctly. Miss any of these details, and your firstborn would die. This is the God of the Old Testament, not a gentle grandfather figure, but a divine warrior who fought for his people by devastating their enemies. And if you happen to be on the wrong side, if you happen to be born into the wrong nation at the wrong time, your survival depended on intelligence networks you probably didn't have access to and rituals you probably didn't understand. But even being on the right side was no guarantee of safety. The Israelites themselves faced divine wrath repeatedly. After the golden calf incident, 3,000 people died in a single day. When Korah challenged Moses' authority, the earth opened up and swallowed him and his followers alive. When the people complained about the food, God sent fiery serpents that killed many of them. When they spoke against God and Moses, a plague broke out that killed 14,700 people. These weren't enemy populations. These were God's chosen people. And they died by the thousands for complaining, for questioning authority, for making religious mistakes. If the chosen people faced such harsh consequences for their failures, what hope would an outsider have? The Old Testament world was unforgiving because it was designed to be. It was a cosmic test, a spiritual boot camp, a divine filter separating the wheat from the chaff. And most people, statistically speaking, were chaff. So, as we drift deeper into this exploration, as we examine the specific challenges that would face a modern person dropped into biblical times, remember this: survival in the Old Testament wasn't about being good enough. It was about being chosen. It wasn't about following rules perfectly. It was about divine favor. And divine favor, as we'll see, was a rare and precious commodity that could be granted or withdrawn at any moment. for reasons that mere mortals could never fully understand. The night is still young, and we've only begun to scratch the surface of this ancient world's dangers. Rest now if you can, because tomorrow we'll venture deeper into the specific ways the Old Testament world would challenge your survival instincts, your moral compass, and your very understanding of justice and mercy. Let your breathing slow now. Let the weight of the day settle into your bones like dust on ancient stone. We've only begun to glimpse the surface of this unforgiving world, and already the challenges seem insurmountable. But there's something else lurking in the shadows of the Old Testament that would make survival even more precarious, something that modern minds struggle to comprehend. The supernatural wasn't metaphorical in this world, it was immediate, present, and absolutely terrifying. Picture this. You're walking through what seems like an ordinary day in ancient Israel. The sun is beating down on the dusty roads. Merchants are hawking their wares. Children are playing in the streets. Everything appears normal, mundane even. Then suddenly, the ground beneath your feet begins to tremble. Not an earthquake, something far more targeted, far more intentional. This is what happened to Korah and his followers when they challenged Moses' authority. Numbers 16 tells us that the earth literally opened its mouth and swallowed them alive. Not metaphorically, not gradually. The ground split apart like a hungry beast and consumed them, men, women, children, and all their possessions. The earth closed over them, and they perished from among the assembly. But here's what makes this even more terrifying. It wasn't random. It was surgical. The ground opened precisely where the rebels stood, and nowhere else. Their neighbors, standing just feet away, watched in horror as their friends and family members were consumed by the earth itself. This wasn't a natural disaster you could predict or prepare for. This was divine intervention, swift and absolute. And if you had been there, if you had unknowingly associated with the wrong people, expressed sympathy for the wrong cause, or simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, you would have gone down with them. Your survival wouldn't have depended on your personal righteousness or your individual relationship with God. It would have depended on your social connections, your political affiliations, your ability to read the supernatural weather and distance yourself from divine targets. The Old Testament world was saturated with this kind of immediate supernatural intervention. Angels weren't gentle beings with soft voices and comforting messages. They were forces of nature, weapons of mass destruction, harbingers of doom that struck terror into the hearts of everyone who encountered them. When an angel appeared to announce Jesus' birth centuries later, the first words out of its mouth were, "Fear not," not because the message was frightening, but because the messenger was. Angels in the Old Testament killed 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in a single night. They struck people blind for looking at them wrong. They wrestled with men until their hip joints were dislocated. They came with flaming swords and voices like rushing waters and appearances that made grown men collapse in terror. If you saw an angel approaching, your first instinct should have been to fall face first into the dirt and pray you weren't about to be obliterated. Your second instinct should have been to examine your recent behavior very, very carefully, because angels didn't make social calls. They came with messages, and those messages were usually along the lines of "stop what you're doing" or "face the consequences," or "you're about to witness something that will change everything." But even more unsettling than the angels were the prophets. These weren't kind, grandfatherly figures offering gentle guidance. They were wild-eyed, often eccentric men who spoke uncomfortable truths and had a direct line to the Almighty. And they were dangerous to be around. Take Elijah, a man so connected to divine power that he could call down fire from heaven, stop the rain for 3.5 years, and outrun chariots. But he was also a man who had 450 prophets of Baal slaughtered after proving their God was powerless. He didn't debate them or try to convert them. He had them killed, all of them, in a single afternoon. Or consider Elisha, Elijah's successor. He seemed harmless enough until a group of young people mocked him for being bald. Their mistake was thinking this was just an ordinary man they could tease with impunity. Instead, Elisha called down a curse in the name of the Lord, and 2 bears came out of the woods and mauled 42 of them. 42 young people killed by wild animals because they made fun of a prophet's appearance. This wasn't an overreaction. This was divine justice. Quick, brutal, and disproportionate by modern standards. In the Old Testament world, mocking a prophet wasn't just rude. It was a capital offense. Because prophets weren't just men. They were God's representatives on earth, and insulting them was tantamount to insulting God himself. And you would have had no way of knowing who was a prophet and who wasn't. They didn't wear special clothing or carry identification cards. They looked like ordinary people until they opened their mouths and spoke words that could topple kingdoms or call down plagues upon entire nations. Your survival would have depended on treating every stranger with the respect due to a potential messenger of God, because the penalty for guessing wrong was death. The supernatural elements of Old Testament life extended beyond just divine messengers and prophets. The very objects around you could be lethal if mishandled. The Ark of the Covenant wasn't just a sacred chest. It was a weapon of mass destruction that killed anyone who touched it improperly. When the Ark was being transported back to Jerusalem, a man named Uzzah saw it beginning to tip from the cart. His instinct was to reach out and steady it, to prevent this sacred object from falling to the ground. It was a noble impulse, a protective gesture. It was also his last act. God struck him dead instantly for touching the ark. He died trying to protect something holy, and his reward was immediate execution. The message was clear. Good intentions were irrelevant. The rules were absolute, and the consequences were final. This same ark had previously killed 70 men in Beth Shemesh simply for looking into it. Not for stealing from it, not for desecrating it, just for satisfying their curiosity about what was inside. 70 men died because they couldn't resist taking a peek. In the Old Testament world, curiosity wasn't just dangerous, it was often fatal. But perhaps nothing illustrates the supernatural dangers of Old Testament life better than the story of Nadab and Abihu, Aaron's sons, who were priests serving in the tabernacle. They offered strange fire before the Lord. Fire that was unauthorized, that didn't follow the precise ritual requirements God had established. The text doesn't elaborate on exactly what they did wrong, which makes it even more terrifying. Fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed them. They died instantly, struck down in the very place where they were serving God. Aaron, their father, was told not to mourn them, not to tear his clothes or uncover his hair, because doing so would bring God's wrath upon the entire congregation. Their bodies were carried out of the camp, and worship continued as if nothing had happened. This is what you were dealing with in the Old Testament world, a realm where the supernatural was immediate and lethal, where the rules were precise but not always clear, where good intentions were no defense against divine wrath. You could be a priest, serving faithfully in the very presence of God, and still die instantly for making the wrong kind of fire. The natural world itself was weaponized in ways that would make modern people question their sanity. Water could turn to blood, rivers could part, the sun could stand still in the sky, rocks could gush forth water, staffs could become serpents. The very elements obeyed divine commands, and if you were on the wrong side of those commands, nature itself would turn against you. During the plagues in Egypt, the Nile, the source of life for the entire civilization, became a river of blood. Fish died, the water stank, and no one could drink from it. Imagine depending on a river for your survival, only to have it transformed into something that would kill you if you consumed it. The very foundation of your existence, suddenly toxic. The frogs that followed weren't just annoying, they were everywhere. In your house, in your bedroom, in your kneading bowls, in your ovens. You couldn't escape them. You couldn't sleep without them crawling over you. You couldn't eat without finding them in your food. The boundaries between the natural and supernatural had collapsed entirely, and this was just the beginning. The gnats covered everything: people, animals, dust transformed into biting insects. The flies swarmed so thickly they corrupted the land. The livestock died en masse. The boils afflicted every person and animal. The hail was so severe it killed anyone caught outside and destroyed everything in the fields. But perhaps most terrifying of all was the darkness. A darkness so thick it could be felt, so complete that people couldn't see each other or rise from their places for 3 days. This wasn't just an absence of light, it was a presence of darkness, a supernatural force that trapped people in their homes and made them prisoners of the night. If you had been an Egyptian during this time, you would have watched your entire world transform into something unrecognizable. The natural laws you depended on would have been suspended. The elements you trusted would have turned against you. Your very environment would have become hostile to human life, and the only protection would have been knowledge you couldn't have possessed and rituals you couldn't have understood. The blood on the doorpost during the final plague wasn't just symbolic. It was a literal shield against the angel of death. But you would have had to know about this protection, understand its requirements, and execute it perfectly. Miss any detail, and your firstborn would die. This is what makes the Old Testament world so uniquely dangerous. It wasn't just politically unstable or socially complex. It was supernaturally active in ways that defied human understanding. The very ground beneath your feet could open up and swallow you. The water you depended on could turn to blood. The animals around you could become instruments of divine judgment. Your survival would have depended not just on following rules or avoiding political entanglements, but on navigating a world where the supernatural was as real and immediate as the sunrise. Where angels walked among men, where prophets spoke words that could reshape reality, where the very elements obeyed commands you couldn't hear and responded to laws you couldn't comprehend. As we continue our journey through this ancient world, as we explore the specific challenges that would face a modern person dropped into biblical times, remember this: the Old Testament wasn't just a different culture or a different time period. It was a different reality entirely. A reality where the supernatural wasn't supernatural at all. It was simply the way things worked. The night grows deeper now, and we've only begun to explore the labyrinthine dangers of this ancient world. Rest if you can, but know that tomorrow we'll venture into even more treacherous territory. We'll examine the social hierarchies that could crush you, the religious rituals that could kill you, and the cosmic forces that viewed human life as little more than pieces on a vast, incomprehensible game board. For now, let the darkness settle around you like a blanket. Let your breathing slow to match the rhythm of ages past. But remember, in the Old Testament world, even sleep wasn't safe. Dreams could be messages from God, and those messages often came with prices that few were prepared to pay. The dreams, you see, weren't just random firings of neurons in a resting brain. They were divine communications, and receiving them came with responsibilities that could destroy your life. When God spoke to you in a dream, He wasn't making a suggestion. He was issuing a command, and failure to obey carried consequences that rippled through generations. Consider poor Pharaoh, tormented by visions of fat and lean cattle, of healthy and withered grain. He had no idea these weren't just stress dreams about agricultural concerns. They were prophetic warnings about 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of famine. But dreams in the Old Testament came without instruction manuals. You had to find someone who could interpret them. And if you chose the wrong interpreter, you'd base your entire kingdom's survival strategy on bad spiritual advice. Joseph, sitting in an Egyptian prison, had the gift of dream interpretation. But imagine if Pharaoh had consulted his court magicians instead, or if Joseph had misread the symbols. An entire civilization would have starved because someone misunderstood a dream about cows. The margin for error was non-existent, and the stakes were always life and death. And it wasn't just rulers who received these nocturnal messages. Ordinary people could be visited by divine dreams, suddenly burdened with knowledge they never asked for and responsibilities they couldn't escape. Jacob dreamed of a ladder reaching to heaven with angels ascending and descending. Beautiful imagery, perhaps, but it came with a covenant that bound not just him, but his descendants for generations. One dream, and suddenly you're the father of a chosen people with all the blessings and curses that entailed. Gideon needed multiple dreams and signs just to convince himself he was really called by God to lead Israel against the Midianites. He asked for fleece to be wet while the ground was dry, then dry while the ground was wet. Even then, he was terrified, because in the Old Testament world, being chosen by God wasn't an honor. It was a death sentence with a temporary reprieve. The prophets understood this better than anyone. When God called them, they didn't celebrate, they ran. Jonah literally fled to the opposite end of the known world rather than deliver God's message to Nineveh. He knew what happened to prophets. They were rejected, persecuted, killed by the very people they were trying to save. The word of God wasn't good news. It was a burden that crushed the spirit and often ended in martyrdom. But running from God's call was futile. Jonah discovered this when he found himself in the belly of a great fish, drowning in digestive juices and seaweed, praying desperately for a second chance. The fish vomited him up on dry land, and he had no choice but to go to Nineveh and preach the message he tried to avoid. Sometimes obedience was the only path to survival, even when obedience meant almost certain death. The social structure of Old Testament society would have been equally treacherous for a modern person to navigate. This wasn't a world of individual rights or personal freedoms. It was a rigid hierarchy where your birth determined your fate, where questioning authority was rebellion, and where rebellion was treason against God himself. At the top sat the king, God's anointed representative on earth. To oppose the king was to oppose God. To criticize the king was to criticize God's choice. To rebel against the king was to rebel against the divine order itself. David, even when he had multiple opportunities to kill King Saul, who was hunting him like an animal, refused to harm the Lord's anointed. Even when Saul was clearly mad, clearly murderous, clearly unfit to rule, David wouldn't raise a hand against him, because to do so would be to challenge God's authority. But serving the king was equally dangerous. Palace intrigue was a blood sport where the wrong word, the wrong alliance, the wrong interpretation of the king's mood could mean exile, imprisonment, or execution. Advisors who gave unwelcome counsel found themselves on the wrong end of a sword. Servants who witnessed the king's private moments carried secrets that could kill them if they spoke, and could kill them if they remained silent. Below the king were the priests, the mediators between God and man. But their position was precarious in ways that would astonish modern religious leaders. They had to perform rituals with absolute precision, follow ceremonial laws without deviation, and maintain purity standards that governed every aspect of their lives. A single mistake in the holy place could mean instant death, as Nadab and Abihu discovered. The priests couldn't just wing it through a service or improvise when they forgot the proper procedure. Every movement, every word, every gesture had been prescribed by God himself. The incense had to be prepared exactly right. The sacrifices had to be offered in precisely the correct manner. The blood had to be sprinkled in the proper pattern. Miss any detail, and divine fire would consume you where you stood. And the pressure was constant. They were on call for every religious emergency, every ritual cleansing, every sacrifice demanded by the law. They had to distinguish between the clean and unclean, the holy and profane, the acceptable and abominable. Their decisions affected people's ability to participate in worship, to live in community, to approach God. Get it wrong, and you weren't just making a professional error. You were leading people into spiritual disaster. The prophets occupied a unique position in this hierarchy. They answered to God alone, which made them simultaneously the most powerful and most vulnerable people in society. They could speak truth to power, confront kings, and challenge religious authorities. But they did so, knowing that their message might be rejected, their warnings ignored, their very lives threatened by those who didn't want to hear uncomfortable truths. Jeremiah spent his entire ministry being persecuted for preaching God's word. He was beaten, imprisoned, thrown into a cistern, and constantly threatened with death. His crime was telling people what God had revealed to him. His punishment was a life of suffering and rejection. He even cursed the day he was born, wishing he had died in his mother's womb, rather than live to deliver messages that brought him nothing but pain. But the prophets couldn't stop. They were compelled by divine force to speak, even when their words fell on deaf ears, even when their warnings went unheeded, even when their very presence brought persecution upon them. They were living examples of what it meant to be caught between God's commands and human resistance, and the pressure often drove them to the edge of madness. Below the religious hierarchy were the common people, and their survival depended on reading social cues they might not understand and following customs they couldn't question. Every interaction was governed by unspoken rules about status, purity, and propriety. Address the wrong person in the wrong way, and you could find yourself accused of disrespect or rebellion. The concept of ritual purity affected every aspect of daily life. Touching the wrong thing, eating the wrong food, going to the wrong place at the wrong time could make you ceremonially unclean. And being unclean wasn't just spiritually problematic, it was socially isolating. You couldn't participate in worship, couldn't interact with others, couldn't even enter certain areas until you had gone through prescribed purification rituals. Women faced additional layers of complexity. They were subject to purity laws related to childbirth and menstruation that could isolate them for weeks at a time. They had to know when they were clean and when they were unclean, when they could touch others and when they couldn't, when they could participate in community life and when they had to remain separate. The penalties for getting it wrong affected not just them, but everyone they came into contact with. The justice system would have been equally bewildering to modern sensibilities. There were no lawyers, no elaborate legal procedures, no presumption of innocence. Justice was swift, communal, and often brutal. Witnesses were required for serious crimes, but their testimony could mean the difference between life and death, and they were expected to participate in the execution if the accused was found guilty. Imagine being called as a witness in a capital case. You had to be absolutely certain of what you saw, because if your testimony led to someone's execution and you were later found to have been mistaken, you could face the same punishment you had helped impose. The law of retaliation wasn't just about the accused, it applied to false witnesses as well, and the methods of execution were designed to be public spectacles that reinforced social order. Stoning wasn't just a means of killing, it was a community ritual where everyone participated in upholding God's law. The witnesses threw the first stones, then the entire assembly joined in. It was democracy in its most primitive form, where the community collectively enforced divine justice. But even the concept of justice was foreign to modern thinking. It wasn't about rehabilitation or even deterrence. It was about maintaining cosmic order, about ensuring that sin didn't contaminate the community, about demonstrating that God's laws were absolute and non-negotiable. The punishment wasn't meant to fit the crime in any proportional sense. It was meant to remove the source of spiritual pollution from among the people. Cities of refuge provided some protection for those who killed accidentally, but reaching them required knowledge of where they were and the ability to flee there before the victim's family could catch up and exact revenge. And even then, You had to remain in the city until the high priest died, which could be years or decades. Your freedom depended on the lifespan of a man you'd probably never met. The economic system would have been equally challenging. There was no social safety net, no unemployment insurance, no welfare system. Your survival depended on your ability to work, your family connections, and your community standing. Fall out of favor with the wrong people, and you could find yourself destitute with no recourse. Debt was a constant threat that could reduce you to slavery. The year of Jubilee was supposed to provide relief, but it came only once every 50 years, and there's debate about whether it was ever actually observed. In the meantime, you could lose your land, your freedom, even your children to creditors. The law provided some protections, but they were limited and often difficult to enforce. The agricultural calendar governed everything. Miss the planting season, and you'd face famine, lose your harvest to weather, pests, or war, and you'd have nothing to sustain you through the winter. There were no global markets to fall back on, no government assistance programs, no alternative food sources. Your survival depended on the success of your crops and the productivity of your livestock. But even successful harvests came with obligations. The tithe wasn't optional. It was a divine command that required you to give a tenth of everything you produced to support the religious system. The poor tithe, the festival tithe, the various offerings and sacrifices all demanded portions of your income. You couldn't just keep what you earned. You had to share it according to God's specific instructions. And underlying all of this was the constant awareness that your individual fate was tied to the collective behavior of your community. God's judgment fell on entire cities, entire nations, entire generations. Your personal righteousness might not be enough to save you if you lived among the wicked. Your individual sins might bring disaster upon your family, your tribe, your entire people. The concept of corporate responsibility permeated every aspect of Old Testament life. When Achan took forbidden plunder from Jericho, all of Israel suffered defeat in battle until his sin was discovered and punished. When David conducted an unauthorized census, plague struck the entire nation. When the people worshipped the golden calf, thousands died, even though they hadn't personally participated in the idolatry. This collective responsibility meant that survival wasn't just about your own behavior. It was about the behavior of everyone around you. You had to be constantly vigilant, watching for signs of sin in your community, ready to speak out against wrongdoing, even when it was committed by friends and family members. Because if you didn't, you might find yourself swept away in the judgment that fell upon the guilty. The weight of this responsibility was crushing. You couldn't just live your own life and mind your own business. You were your brother's keeper, responsible for his spiritual welfare as well as your own. And if you failed in this responsibility, if you remained silent when you should have spoken, if you tolerated sin when you should have confronted it, you became complicit in the corruption that would inevitably bring divine wrath upon the entire community. This is the world we're exploring, a world where individual survival depended on collective righteousness, where personal safety required community vigilance, where the actions of one person could doom an entire nation. It was a world that would challenge every assumption you have about justice, fairness, and individual responsibility. As the night deepens and these ancient realities settle into your consciousness like sediment in still water, remember that we've only begun to map the treacherous landscape of Old Testament life. The social structures, the religious obligations, the supernatural dangers, all of these were just the foundation upon which an even more complex and perilous existence was built. Rest now, if you can, but know that tomorrow we'll venture deeper into this unforgiving world. We'll explore the specific ways that divine favor could be gained and lost, the precise rituals that meant the difference between life and death, and the cosmic forces that viewed human existence as little more than a test of obedience in a universe where mercy was rare and justice was absolute. Let your breathing slow to match the rhythm of ancient prayers. Let your heartbeats synchronize with the cadence of forgotten psalms. But remember, in the Old Testament world, even rest came with responsibilities, and even sleep was subject to divine visitation. Dreams could be commands, and commands once given could never be ignored. The morning light in the Old Testament world didn't bring the gentle promise of a new day. It brought fresh opportunities for divine testing, new chances to fail spectacularly, and the ever-present possibility that today might be the day God decided you'd had enough chances. Because survival in this ancient world wasn't just about navigating the supernatural dangers or the social hierarchies we've already explored. It was about understanding that every single day was an examination, and the examiner was omniscient, omnipotent, and had very specific ideas about what constituted passing and failing grades. Consider the simple act of waking up. In our modern world, you might roll over, check your phone, stumble to the kitchen for coffee. But in ancient Israel, your first conscious moment was already fraught with spiritual significance. Had you dreamed? If so, was it a message from God that required action? Had you remained ritually pure through the night? Were there morning prayers to be said, offerings to be made, purification rituals to be performed? The morning sacrifice at the temple wasn't just a religious service. It was the cosmic reset button that kept the universe functioning properly. Miss it, and you weren't just skipping church, you were potentially contributing to the breakdown of the covenant relationship between God and his people. And when that relationship broke down, everyone suffered. The priests who performed these daily rituals lived under pressure that would crush a modern person. They had to rise before dawn, wash in the prescribed manner, dress in the specific garments, and perform every action with mathematical precision. The fire on the altar had to be maintained constantly. It could never go out. The incense had to be offered at exactly the right time. The sacrifices had to be perfect, unblemished, offered in the correct sequence with the proper words. And they had to do this every single day, without fail, knowing that one mistake could mean instant death. Not just for them, but potentially for the entire community they served. The weight of that responsibility would have been unbearable. Every morning brought the possibility of catastrophic failure, and there was no room for off days, no sick leave, no vacation time from divine service. But even if you weren't a priest, even if you were just an ordinary person trying to make it through another day, the religious obligations were inescapable. The law required daily prayers, regular offerings, constant awareness of your spiritual state. You couldn't just be a good person and hope for the best. You had to be a good person in very specific ways, following very specific rules, at very specific times. Take the concept of the Sabbath year, for instance. Every seventh year, the land was supposed to rest. No planting, no harvesting, no agricultural work at all. Just trust that God would provide enough food to sustain the entire population for a year without any farming. The economic implications were staggering. How do you feed a nation without agriculture? How do you survive without the very activity that forms the foundation of your economy? But questioning the Sabbath year wasn't just practical concern. It was spiritual rebellion. God had commanded it, and that was supposed to be enough. Your survival depended on faith that defied logic, trust that ignored practical considerations, obedience that required you to act against every survival instinct you possessed. And if the community failed to observe the Sabbath year, if they continued farming because they were afraid of starvation, they weren't just breaking an agricultural regulation. They were violating the fundamental principle of trust in God's provision. The consequences wouldn't just be economic, they would be cosmic. The land itself would vomit out its inhabitants, exile would follow, and the entire social structure would collapse. The year of Jubilee was even more radical. Every 50th year, All debts were forgiven, all slaves were freed, all land returned to its original families. Imagine the economic chaos this would create. Imagine the social upheaval. Imagine the resistance from those who had accumulated wealth and power through legal means, only to be told that every 50 years, the entire system would be reset to zero. But Jubilee wasn't just about economics. It was about demonstrating that God, not human institutions, was the ultimate authority. Property rights, debt obligations, social hierarchies, all of these were temporary arrangements that existed only at divine pleasure. When God said it was time to start over, you started over, regardless of the personal cost. The historical evidence suggests that Jubilee was rarely, if ever, fully observed, which tells us something important about the gap between divine ideals and human reality. Even God's chosen people struggled to live up to the standards He set. And if they couldn't do it, with all their advantages and divine guidance, what hope would you have as an outsider trying to navigate this system? The concept of ritual purity would have been particularly challenging for modern people to understand. It wasn't about hygiene in the way we think of it. It was about spiritual contamination that was invisible but absolutely real. You could become unclean through no fault of your own, simply by being in the wrong place at the wrong time or coming into contact with the wrong things. Death made you unclean. Childbirth made you unclean. Certain skin conditions made you unclean. Bodily functions made you unclean. Even touching someone who was unclean made you unclean. The contagion spread through contact, through proximity, through association. You could wake up clean and go to bed defiled, not because you'd done anything wrong, but because ritual impurity was woven into the fabric of existence itself. And being unclean wasn't just inconvenient, it was spiritually dangerous. You couldn't participate in worship, couldn't approach the temple, couldn't even live in the community until you'd gone through the prescribed purification rituals. Some of these rituals were simple. Wash your clothes, bathe yourself, wait until evening. Others were complex and expensive, requiring specific sacrifices, particular procedures, waiting periods that could last weeks. The laws governing clean and unclean animals weren't just dietary restrictions, they were cosmic categories that separated the sacred from the profane. Eat the wrong thing and you weren't just violating a food law, you were aligning yourself with chaos rather than order, with the unclean rather than the holy. You were choosing to identify with creatures that God had designated as abominations. But how would you know which animals were clean and which were unclean? The lists in Leviticus are detailed, but not exhaustive. You had to understand the principles: cloven hooves and chewing cud for land animals, fins and scales for water creatures, specific birds that were acceptable while others were forbidden. Get it wrong, and you defiled yourself. Get it right, and you'd maintained your ritual purity for another day. The clothing laws were equally specific and equally mysterious. You couldn't wear garments made from mixed fibers, no wool and linen together. You couldn't plant your fields with mixed seeds. You couldn't crossbreed your livestock. The principle seemed to be that mixing categories was inherently wrong, that God had established boundaries that shouldn't be crossed. But why? The text doesn't explain the reasoning behind these laws. It simply states them as divine commands that must be obeyed. Your survival depended on following rules you couldn't understand, for reasons you weren't given, with consequences you couldn't predict. It was obedience for its own sake, faith without explanation, trust without justification. The festivals and holy days created their own challenges. 7 major festivals throughout the year, each with its own requirements, its own rituals, its own opportunities for spiritual disaster. Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits, Pentecost, trumpets, Day of Atonement, tabernacles. Each one demanded specific preparations, particular sacrifices, precise observances. The Day of Atonement was particularly terrifying. This was the one day of the year when the high priest entered the Holy of Holies, the most sacred space in the temple, to make atonement for the sins of the entire nation. If he made a mistake, if he wasn't properly prepared, if he approached God incorrectly, he would die instantly. They tied a rope around his ankle so they could pull his body out if necessary, because no one else could enter that sacred space to retrieve him. And the entire nation's spiritual welfare depended on this one man performing this one ritual correctly. Everyone's fate hung in the balance, while the high priest disappeared behind the veil, carrying the sins of the people into the presence of God. The tension must have been unbearable. The collective held breath of an entire nation waiting to see if their representative would emerge alive or be struck down for approaching the divine throne improperly. But even the festivals that were supposed to be joyful carried hidden dangers. The Feast of Tabernacles required you to build temporary shelters and live in them for a week, remembering the wilderness wandering. But the shelters had to be built correctly, with the right materials, in the right way. The celebration had to be conducted properly, with the right attitude, for the right reasons. Nadab and Abihu had been celebrating, offering incense before the Lord during what should have been a joyful religious service. But they offered strange fire, unauthorized fire that didn't follow the prescribed ritual. Their celebration became their funeral, their joy became their judgment, their service became their sentence. The lesson was clear. There was no such thing as casual worship, no room for improvisation in religious matters, no acceptable shortcuts in approaching the divine. Every act of devotion was a potential death trap. Every religious service a test that could end in disaster. The very acts that were supposed to bring you closer to God could destroy you if performed incorrectly. The concept of blasphemy extended far beyond obvious insults to God. It included any improper use of his name, any casual reference to divine authority, any failure to treat sacred things with appropriate reverence. The punishment was death by stoning, carried out by the entire community. Everyone participated in the execution, from the youngest child who could throw a rock to the oldest elder who could barely lift his arm. But what constituted blasphemy wasn't always clear. The boundaries were fluid, the definitions imprecise. You could cross the line without realizing it, violate the sacred without intending to, commit a capital offense through ignorance rather than malice. And ignorance was no defense. The law was the law, and violation brought consequences regardless of intent. The story of the man who gathered sticks on the Sabbath illustrates this perfectly. He wasn't intentionally rebelling against God. He wasn't making a theological statement. He was probably just cold, or his family needed fuel for cooking. But he gathered sticks on the wrong day, and that simple act of practical necessity became a capital crime. Moses had to inquire of the Lord to determine the punishment, which suggests that even the greatest prophet in Israel's history wasn't certain how seriously God took this particular violation. The answer came back swift and final: stone him to death. The entire congregation participated in the execution, turning neighbors into executioners and transforming a community gathering into a ritual of judgment. This is what made the Old Testament world so uniquely perilous. The rules were absolute, but their applications weren't always obvious. The consequences were severe, but the boundaries weren't always clear. You could live your entire life trying to be righteous and still make the one mistake that would destroy you. You could follow every law you knew and still discover that you'd been violating others without realizing it. The genealogies that seem so boring to modern readers were actually matters of life and death importance. Your lineage determined your tribal affiliation, your inheritance rights, your marriage prospects, your social standing. But more than that, it determined your spiritual status. Certain bloodlines were blessed, others were cursed. Some families were chosen for special roles. Others were excluded from the congregation entirely. The descendants of Aaron could serve as priests. The tribe of Levi was set apart for religious service. The line of David was promised the throne forever. but the descendants of certain unions were forbidden from entering the assembly of the Lord even to the 10th generation. Your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather as choices could still be affecting your spiritual status centuries later, and you had to know your genealogy perfectly. You had to be able to trace your lineage back through the generations, proving your right to whatever position or privilege you claimed. False claims about ancestry weren't just fraud. They were spiritual rebellion that could bring divine judgment upon your entire family line. The marriage laws were equally complex and equally crucial. You couldn't marry just anyone you loved. You had to marry within acceptable boundaries, avoiding relationships that God had forbidden. The prohibited degrees of consanguinity were extensive and specific. Marry the wrong person, and you'd contaminated your bloodline forever. Your children would suffer for your mistake, and their children after them. But the marriage laws weren't just about avoiding incest. They were about maintaining the purity of the people, preserving the distinctiveness of the chosen nation, preventing the spiritual contamination that came from association with foreign gods and foreign ways. Marriage to non-Israelites wasn't just culturally problematic, it was spiritually dangerous, a betrayal of the covenant relationship that defined the nation's identity. The story of Phinehas illustrates how seriously God took these boundaries. When an Israelite man brought a Midianite woman into the camp, Phinehas didn't report the violation to the authorities or call for a trial. He took a spear and killed them both, right there in the act. His zealous violence ended a plague that had already killed 24,000 people. God rewarded his action with a covenant of peace and eternal priesthood for his descendants. This wasn't vigilante justice. It was divine approval of extreme measures to protect the community from spiritual contamination. The lesson was clear. Some violations were so serious that immediate action was required, and that action could be violent, final, and divinely sanctioned. The concept of the ban, or herem, extended this principle to entire populations. When God commanded the Israelites to destroy certain cities completely, he wasn't just ordering military victory, he was commanding spiritual purification through total annihilation. Every person, every animal, every possession was to be destroyed utterly, devoted to God through destruction. This wasn't about conquest or plunder, it was about preventing contamination. The people of these cities were so corrupted, so spiritually dangerous, that contact with them would contaminate the chosen people. The only solution was complete elimination, total removal of the source of spiritual pollution. Achan's sin at Jericho shows how seriously God took these commands. He kept some of the devoted things, a beautiful robe, some silver, some gold. It seemed like a small thing, a minor violation of the rules of war, but it brought defeat upon the entire army at Ai, and it cost him his life and the lives of his entire family. They were stoned to death and burned, along with all their possessions, because his disobedience had contaminated the entire community. The message was unmistakable. Obedience had to be total, complete, without reservation or exception. There was no room for personal judgment, no space for individual discretion, no tolerance for partial compliance. God's commands were absolute, and absolute obedience was the only acceptable response. This is the world you would have faced as a time traveler dropped into the Old Testament. A world where every action had spiritual significance, where every choice carried eternal consequences, where every day brought fresh opportunities for catastrophic failure. It was a world that would test every assumption you have about justice, mercy, and the nature of divine love. The night is growing deeper now, and the weight of these ancient realities settles around us like dust on forgotten altars. We've explored the surface dangers, the obvious pitfalls, the immediate threats that would face any modern person thrust into this unforgiving world. But we've only begun to understand the deeper currents that shaped every aspect of existence in the Old Testament. Rest now, if you can. But remember that in the world we're exploring, rest itself was regulated by divine law. The Sabbath wasn't just a day off. It was a commandment that carried the death penalty for violation. Even sleep was subject to divine visitation, and dreams could bring responsibilities that would reshape your entire existence. As your breathing slows and your thoughts begin to drift, remember that we've only touched the edges of this ancient world's complexity. Tomorrow, we'll venture deeper into the specific mechanisms of divine judgment, the precise rituals that meant the difference between blessing and curse, and the cosmic forces that viewed human existence as a test of faith in a universe where mercy was rare and justice was absolute. The darkness gathers around us now like the shadow of ancient mountains, and in that darkness, we can almost hear the whispers of forgotten prayers, the echoes of sacrificial fires, the distant sound of stones falling upon condemned flesh. This is the world that shaped the foundation of Western civilization, the world that gave birth to concepts of law and justice that still influence us today. But it was also a world that would challenge every modern assumption about human dignity, individual rights, and the nature of divine love. A world where survival depended not on strength or intelligence, but on perfect obedience to laws that were absolute, mysterious, and utterly unforgiving. Sleep well, dear traveller, but know that tomorrow we'll continue our journey into this ancient realm where the supernatural was ordinary, where the divine was dangerous, and where every sunrise brought fresh opportunities for both blessing and catastrophe. The Old Testament world awaits, patient and eternal, ready to test your faith, your courage, and your very understanding of what it means to be human in a universe governed by forces beyond mortal comprehension. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Old Testament survival wasn't the obvious dangers, the plagues, the supernatural interventions, the divine wrath that could erase cities overnight. It was the quiet, persistent awareness that God was testing you constantly, in ways you couldn't predict or prepare for. These weren't the grand, dramatic tests that made it into the scriptures. They were the small daily examinations that revealed the true state of your heart. The beggar at your gate might be an angel in disguise. The stranger asking for directions might be a prophet testing your hospitality. The seemingly innocent request from a neighbor might be your opportunity to demonstrate the love of God or reveal the selfishness that would damn you. Abraham faced this when 3 visitors appeared at his tent during the heat of the day. They looked like ordinary travelers, dusty and tired from their journey. But Abraham sensed something different about them. He rushed to provide the best hospitality he could offer: fresh bread, a tender calf, milk and curds. Only later did he discover that he had been entertaining the Lord himself, along with 2 angels who were on their way to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. What if Abraham had been having a bad day? What if he'd been tired, or sick, or simply not in the mood for guests? What if he'd given them the leftovers instead of the best calf from his herd? The text doesn't say, but the implications are terrifying. His hospitality in that moment may have saved not just his own soul, but the lives of everyone in his household. This is what made the Old Testament world so psychologically exhausting. You could never relax, never let your guard down, never assume that any interaction was purely mundane. Every encounter was potentially a divine test, every decision a moment of eternal significance. The pressure of living under such constant scrutiny would have been unbearable for most people. The concept of divine hiddenness made it even worse. God didn't announce his presence with trumpets and heavenly choirs most of the time. He came disguised as ordinary circumstances, hidden in the fabric of daily life. The test wasn't whether you could recognize the obvious manifestations of divine power. It was whether you could discern God's presence in the seemingly mundane moments that made up most of existence. Consider the story of Elijah during the drought. God told him to go to the brook Cherith, where ravens would feed him. Ravens, unclean birds, scavengers, creatures that fed on carrion. But they brought him bread and meat every morning and evening, sustaining him through the famine. Later, when the brook dried up, God sent him to a widow in Zarephath who was down to her last meal. She was preparing to eat it with her son and then die of starvation. But Elijah asked her to feed him first, promising that her flour and oil would not run out until the drought ended. Imagine being that widow, faced with a choice between feeding your starving child and obeying the demand of a strange prophet. Everything in her maternal instincts would have screamed against it. But she obeyed, and her household was sustained throughout the famine. The test wasn't whether she could recognize Elijah as a prophet. It was whether she could act in faith when faith made no logical sense. Could she trust God's provision when all evidence pointed to death? Could she choose obedience over survival instinct? Could she believe that giving away her last meal would somehow result in having more food, not less? This is the kind of test that would have destroyed most modern people. We're trained to think logically, to make rational decisions based on available evidence. But the Old Testament world required a different kind of thinking, one that could embrace paradox, accept mystery, and act on faith even when faith seemed foolish. The story of the Shunammite woman illustrates this perfectly. She showed hospitality to Elisha, providing him with a room and meals whenever he passed through. In return, Elisha promised her a son, even though she was past childbearing age and her husband was old. The promise seemed impossible, but it came true. She conceived and bore a son, but then the child died suddenly, apparently from a head injury. The woman didn't mourn, didn't panic, didn't even tell her husband what had happened. She simply laid the child on Elisha's bed, saddled a donkey, and rode to find the prophet. When people asked if everything was well, she said yes, even though her son was dead in the next room. This wasn't denial. It was faith. She believed that the same God who had given her the impossible gift of a child could give her the even more impossible gift of resurrection. And she was right. Elisha came and raised the boy from the dead. But her faith had to be tested first. She had to prove that she could trust God, even when circumstances seemed to contradict his promises. The testing extended beyond individual faith to collective obedience. The conquest of Jericho provides a perfect example. God's battle plan was absurd by military standards. March around the city once a day for 6 days, then 7 times on the 7th day. Blow trumpets and shout. No siege engines, no scaling ladders, no conventional tactics at all. Just walking and noise-making. Any competent military commander would have laughed at such a strategy. But Joshua obeyed, and the walls collapsed. The test wasn't whether Israel could defeat Jericho in battle. It was whether they could follow God's instructions even when those instructions seemed foolish. Could they trust divine strategy over human wisdom? Could they believe that God's ways were higher than their ways, even when they couldn't understand the logic? But the testing at Jericho wasn't over when the walls fell. The real test came with the ban, the command to destroy everything in the city and take no plunder for themselves. After a military victory, soldiers expected to profit from their conquest. It was the standard practice of ancient warfare. But God demanded something different. Everything in Jericho was to be devoted to him through destruction, except for the silver, gold, and articles of bronze and iron, which were to go into the treasury of the Lord's house. This was a test of whether Israel could obey God's commands, even when those commands cost them personally. Could they destroy wealth instead of keeping it? Could they follow divine law, even when it meant giving up legitimate spoils of war? Could they trust that God would provide for them in other ways if they obeyed his specific instructions about this particular victory? Most of them passed the test, but Achan failed spectacularly. He saw a beautiful robe from Babylonia, 200 shekels of silver, and a bar of gold weighing 50 shekels. He took them and hid them under his tent. It seemed like a small thing, just a few items from a vast city full of plunder, but it brought defeat upon the entire army at Ai, and it cost him his life and the lives of his entire family. The message was unmistakable. Partial obedience was complete disobedience. There was no such thing as mostly following God's commands. Either you obeyed completely or you faced the consequences of rebellion. And those consequences affected not just you, but everyone around you. This collective responsibility created a social dynamic that would be unrecognizable to modern individualists. Your personal choices weren't just personal, they affected your family, your tribe, your entire nation. When you sinned, you weren't just damaging your own relationship with God. You were potentially bringing divine judgment upon everyone you knew and loved. The story of David's census illustrates this principle perfectly. David ordered a count of the fighting men in Israel, apparently out of pride or a desire to measure his military strength. It seemed like a reasonable thing for a king to do. Know the size of your army, understand your military capabilities, make informed decisions about national defense. But God was displeased with the census. The text doesn't explain exactly why, but the implication is that David was trusting in military might rather than divine protection. He was counting soldiers instead of counting on God. It was a subtle shift from faith to self-reliance, from dependence on divine provision to confidence in human resources. The punishment was severe and collective. David was given 3 choices: 3 years of famine, 3 months of fleeing from enemies, or 3 days of plague. He chose the plague, reasoning that it was better to fall into God's hands than into human hands. But the plague killed 70,000 people. Not soldiers, not officials, not people who had anything to do with the census decision. Ordinary citizens died because their king had made a choice that displeased God. David's response reveals the psychological torment of living under such collective responsibility. He cried out to God, "Was it not I who ordered the fighting men to be counted? I, the shepherd, have sinned and done wrong. These are but sheep. What have they done? Lord my God, let your hand fall on me and my family, but do not let this plague remain on your people." But God's justice didn't work that way. The consequences of leadership decisions fell upon the entire community. The sins of the powerful affected the powerless. The mistakes of the few brought suffering upon the many. There was no individual immunity from collective judgment, no personal righteousness that could shield you from the consequences of living among the guilty. This understanding of corporate responsibility permeated every aspect of Old Testament life. Families were judged as units, tribes were blessed or cursed together, cities were saved or destroyed based on the collective righteousness of their inhabitants. Nations rose and fell according to their communal faithfulness to God's laws. The implications for personal survival were staggering. It wasn't enough to be individually righteous. You had to live among the righteous. It wasn't sufficient to follow God's laws yourself. You had to ensure that your community was following them as well. You had to be constantly vigilant, watching for signs of sin among your neighbors, ready to confront wrongdoing even when it was committed by people you cared about. The story of Eli the priest shows what happened when spiritual leaders failed to maintain this vigilance. Eli was personally righteous, but his sons were corrupt. They were taking the best portions of the sacrifices for themselves, sleeping with the women who served at the entrance to the tent of meeting, and generally treating the worship of God with contempt. Eli rebuked them, but he didn't remove them from their positions. He didn't take decisive action to stop their corruption. He prioritized family loyalty over spiritual responsibility, and the consequences were catastrophic. A prophet came to him with a message of judgment. Both of his sons would die on the same day. His family line would be cut off from the priesthood, and the glory would depart from Israel. The judgment fell exactly as prophesied. Both sons died in battle on the same day. The Ark of the Covenant was captured by the Philistines. When Eli heard the news, he fell backward from his chair, broke his neck, and died. His daughter-in-law went into premature labor and died giving birth to a son she named Ichabod. The glory has departed from Israel. The lesson was clear. Spiritual leaders who tolerated corruption in their families would see their entire legacy destroyed. It wasn't enough to be personally faithful. You had to ensure that those under your authority were faithful as well. And if you failed in this responsibility, the consequences would extend far beyond your own life. This principle extended to every level of society. Parents were responsible for their children's spiritual welfare. Husbands were responsible for their wives' obedience to God's laws. Kings were responsible for their subjects' collective righteousness. Priests were responsible for the spiritual health of the entire community. The weight of this responsibility was crushing. You couldn't just focus on your own relationship with God. You had to manage the spiritual lives of everyone around you. You had to be teacher, judge, and enforcer all at once. You had to know when to speak and when to remain silent, when to be gentle and when to be severe, when to show mercy and when to demand justice. And the penalties for getting it wrong were severe. Fail to discipline your children properly, and you might face the same judgment as Eli. Fail to confront sin in your community, and you might be swept away in the judgment that fell upon the guilty. Fail to maintain the spiritual standards of your household, and you might find yourself excluded from the covenant community entirely. The story of Ananias and Sapphira, though technically from the New Testament, illustrates the same principle at work. They sold property and brought part of the proceeds to the apostles, claiming it was the full amount. They weren't required to give everything. They could have kept whatever they wanted, but they lied about how much they were giving, apparently to appear more generous than they actually were. The punishment was immediate and final. Both of them dropped dead when confronted with their deception. Not for stealing, not for refusing to give, but for lying about what they were giving. The message was clear. God cared more about honesty than about the size of the gift. Hypocrisy was a greater sin than selfishness, but the broader lesson was about the danger of spiritual pretense. You couldn't fake your way through a relationship with God. You couldn't maintain appearances while harboring secret sins. You couldn't present a righteous facade while living a corrupt life. God saw through every deception, and his judgment was swift and final. This is what made the Old Testament world so spiritually exhausting. You had to be genuinely righteous, not just apparently righteous. You had to maintain perfect integrity, not just public respectability. You had to be honest about your failures, not just successful at hiding them. And you had to do all of this while living among people who were also struggling with the same impossible standards. The psychological pressure would have been unbearable for most modern people. We're used to privacy, to personal space, to the ability to compartmentalize our lives. But the Old Testament world offered no such luxury. Every thought, every motive, every hidden desire was visible to God. Every action, every word, every moment of negligence was recorded in the divine ledger. There was no escape from the constant scrutiny of omniscient eyes. The only relief came through the sacrificial system, but even that was fraught with danger. The offerings had to be perfect. The procedures had to be followed exactly. The heart attitude had to be right. Bring a blemished animal, and you'd insulted God. Follow the wrong ritual, and you'd committed an abomination. Offer a sacrifice with the wrong motives, and you'd made things worse instead of better. King Saul learned this lesson the hard way when he offered sacrifices before Samuel arrived. He was facing a military crisis, his men were deserting, and the prophet was late. So he took matters into his own hands and offered the burnt offering himself. It seemed like a reasonable response to urgent circumstances, but it cost him his kingdom. Samuel's response was devastating. You have done foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. For now, the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever, but now your kingdom shall not continue. The message was clear. Good intentions were no excuse for disobedience. Practical necessity was no justification for violating God's commands. Emergency circumstances didn't suspend divine law. Either you followed God's instructions exactly, or you faced the consequences of rebellion. This is the world that would have tested every assumption you have about fairness, justice, and the nature of divine love. It was a world where mercy was rare, where second chances were scarce, where the margin for error was non-existent. It was a world that demanded perfection from imperfect people, absolute obedience from fallible creatures, unwavering faith from minds that naturally questioned and doubted. As the ancient night settles around us like a burial shroud, as the weight of these impossible standards presses down upon our consciousness, we begin to understand why the Old Testament world was so unforgiving. It wasn't designed for human comfort or convenience. It was designed to demonstrate the absolute holiness of God and the desperate need for divine grace. The darkness deepens now, and in that darkness we can almost hear the whispers of ancient prayers, the echoes of sacrificial fires, the distant sound of stones falling upon condemned flesh. This is the world that shaped the foundation of Western civilization, the world that gave birth to concepts of law and justice that still influence us today. But it was also a world that would challenge every modern assumption about human dignity, individual rights, and the nature of divine love. A world where survival depended not on strength or intelligence, but on perfect obedience to laws that were absolute, mysterious, and utterly unforgiving. The night grows deeper still, and we've only begun to explore the labyrinthine dangers of this ancient realm. Rest now, if you can, but know that tomorrow we'll venture into even more treacherous territory. We'll examine the specific ways that divine favor could be gained and lost, the precise rituals that meant the difference between life and death, and the cosmic forces that viewed human existence as little more than a test of faith in a universe where mercy was rare and justice was absolute. For now, let the darkness settle around you like a blanket woven from forgotten prayers. Let your breathing slow to match the rhythm of ancient psalms. But remember, in the Old Testament world, even sleep came with responsibilities, and even dreams were subject to divine visitation. The morning light, when it came, would bring fresh opportunities for testing, new chances for failure, and the ever-present possibility that today might be the day when your faith would be weighed in the balance and found wanting. The God of the Old Testament was not a gentle grandfather figure offering unconditional love and endless second chances. He was a consuming fire, a jealous deity who demanded absolute loyalty and punished rebellion with swift and terrible judgment. To survive in his presence required more than good intentions. It required perfect obedience, unwavering faith, and the kind of spiritual vigilance that few mortals could sustain. This is the world we continue to explore, patient and eternal, ready to test your faith, your courage, and your very understanding of what it means to be human in a universe governed by forces beyond mortal comprehension. The Old Testament awaits, and its lessons are written in blood and fire, in the tears of the faithful and the screams of the condemned. Sleep well, dear traveller, but sleep lightly. For in the world of the Old Testament, even rest was a privilege that could be revoked at any moment, and even dreams could become divine commands that would reshape your entire existence. The night is long, but the testing never ends, and survival depends on understanding that in this ancient world, mercy was not a right to be claimed, but a gift to be received, and that gift was rarer than gold and more precious than life itself. The morning prayers weren't suggestions. They were survival protocols. In the Old Testament world, you didn't wake up and check the weather. You woke up and checked your spiritual temperature. Had you remained ritually pure through the night? Were there sins to confess before the sun cleared the horizon? Had your dreams carried divine messages that required immediate action? The Hebrew word for morning boker literally means to search or to examine. Dawn wasn't just daybreak, it was investigation time. The light exposed what darkness had hidden, and in a world where God's eyes never slept, what he had seen during the night could determine whether you lived to see another sunset. Consider the morning ritual of the priests at the temple. They rose before dawn, not by choice, but by divine mandate. The fire on the altar could never be extinguished. It had burned continuously since Moses first lit it, and maintaining it was literally a matter of life and death. The priest who let that fire die wouldn't just lose his job, he'd lose his life, struck down by the same divine fire that was supposed to burn upon the altar. But it wasn't just about keeping flames alive. Every morning brought the Tamid offering, the daily sacrifice that kept the covenant relationship between God and Israel functioning. 2 lambs, one at dawn and one at dusk, offered with mathematical precision. The wrong timing, the wrong procedure, the wrong heart attitude, and you weren't just performing a ritual incorrectly. You were potentially severing the spiritual lifeline that kept an entire nation from drowning in divine wrath. The pressure was extraordinary. Imagine being responsible for a ritual that, if performed incorrectly, could bring God's judgment upon millions of people. Every morning, the priest handling the sacrifice knew that one mistake, a stumble, a forgotten word, an impure thought, could trigger a catastrophe that would make the plagues of Egypt look like a gentle warning. And the rituals themselves were bewilderingly complex. The blood had to be sprinkled in specific patterns. The organs had to be arranged in particular ways. The incense had to be prepared with exact ingredients in precise proportions. The prayers had to be recited word for word, with no improvisation, no personal touches, no adjustments for contemporary relevance. This wasn't worship as we understand it today. It was cosmic maintenance. The universe, according to Old Testament thinking, required constant spiritual upkeep to prevent it from sliding back into chaos. The sacrifices weren't just religious services. They were the divine equivalent of changing the oil in creation's engine. Skip them, and everything breaks down. But even if you weren't a priest, even if you were just an ordinary person trying to make it through another day, the morning brought its own set of spiritual landmines. The laws of ritual purity meant that you could wake up clean and be contaminated before breakfast. Touch the wrong thing, eat the wrong food, go to the wrong place, and you'd spend the rest of the day in a state of spiritual quarantine. The concept of tuma, ritual impurity, permeated every aspect of daily life. It wasn't about hygiene in the modern sense. It was about spiritual contamination that was invisible, but absolutely real. You could become unclean through contact with death, disease, bodily functions, certain animals, even certain people. And once you were unclean, you couldn't participate in worship, couldn't enter the temple, couldn't even live in the community until you'd gone through elaborate purification rituals. The terrifying part was how easily you could become contaminated without realizing it. Walk past a cemetery and you might be unclean. Touch someone who had touched a corpse and you'd absorbed their impurity. Eat food that had come into contact with something forbidden and you'd defiled yourself from the inside out. And the purification process was often more complex than the contamination. Some forms of impurity required 7 days of separation, multiple washings, specific sacrifices, and the involvement of priests who could declare you clean again. Other forms required even longer periods of isolation, more expensive offerings, more elaborate rituals. The economic implications were staggering. Every time you became ritually impure, you lost income. You couldn't work, couldn't trade, couldn't participate in the economic life of the community. The purification rituals themselves cost money: animals for sacrifice, materials for cleansing, fees for priestly services. Being holy was expensive, and being unholy was financially devastating. But the social implications were even worse. In a world where community was everything, where survival depended on your ability to maintain relationships with neighbors, family, and tribal members, ritual impurity meant isolation. You became a spiritual leper, cut off from the very networks that made life possible. The laws governing clean and unclean foods created their own maze of potential disasters. Leviticus 11 reads like a biological classification system designed by someone who had never heard of taxonomy. Land animals were clean if they both chewed cud and had split hooves. Miss either qualification, and they were abominations. Water creatures needed both fins and scales. Birds were classified by specific species, with no general rules to guide you. But the complexity went far beyond simple identification. The prohibition against eating anything that had died naturally or been torn by wild animals meant you had to know not just what kind of animal you were eating, but how it had died. The ban on consuming blood meant you had to understand proper slaughter techniques and drainage procedures. The separation of meat and dairy meant you had to track the entire preparation process of every meal. Imagine being invited to dinner at a neighbor's house. The food looks delicious, smells wonderful, and your host has prepared it with obvious care. But you have no idea about the source of the ingredients, the method of preparation, or the ritual cleanliness of the cooking vessels. Every bite is a gamble. Eat something forbidden, and you've not only violated God's law, you've made yourself ritually impure, which means you'll need to go through purification rituals that could take days and cost more than you can afford. The social pressure was intense. Refusing food could be seen as an insult to your host, a rejection of their hospitality, a sign of arrogance or superiority. But accepting food without knowing its pedigree could be spiritual suicide. You had to navigate these situations with diplomatic skill that would challenge a modern ambassador, all while maintaining the appearance of casual social interaction. The clothing laws added another layer of complexity to daily life. The prohibition against wearing garments made from mixed fibers, shatnez in Hebrew, meant you had to understand textile production in ways that would baffle most modern consumers. Wool and linen couldn't be woven together, but the law was interpreted to include any combination of these materials, even if they were just touching each other. This wasn't just about the clothes on your back. It affected bedding, furniture coverings, even the materials used in religious ceremonies. You had to be constantly vigilant about fabric composition, which required knowledge of manufacturing processes that were often trade secrets. Buy the wrong garment, and you'd be walking around in a violation of divine law until you could afford to replace it. The economic disruption was significant. Quality textiles were expensive, and discovering that something you owned violated the mixing prohibition meant you had to dispose of it completely. You couldn't sell it to someone else. That would be causing them to sin. You couldn't modify it to separate the materials. The prohibition was absolute. You could only destroy it and absorb the financial loss. But the mixing laws extended beyond textiles to agriculture and animal husbandry. You couldn't plant your vineyard with two kinds of seed. You couldn't plow with an ox and a donkey yoked together. You couldn't breed different species of animals. The principle seemed to be that God had created distinct categories, and human attempts to blur those boundaries were acts of rebellion against the divine order. The practical implications were enormous. Agriculture in the ancient world was already challenging enough without additional restrictions on farming techniques. The prohibition against mixing seeds meant you couldn't diversify your crops to protect against total failure. The restriction on yoking different animals meant you couldn't use the most efficient combinations for different tasks. The ban on crossbreeding meant you couldn't improve your livestock through selective breeding. These weren't just inconveniences, they were survival challenges. In a world where crop failure meant starvation, where livestock disease could destroy a family's wealth, where natural disasters could wipe out entire communities, the mixing laws added additional layers of risk to an already precarious existence. The festival calendar created its own set of challenges. 7 major festivals throughout the year, each with its own requirements, its own rituals, its own opportunities for spiritual disaster. These weren't optional observances. They were divine commands that carried the death penalty for violation. The Feast of Unleavened Bread required you to remove every trace of leavened bread from your house for 7 days. Not just avoid eating it, remove it entirely. You had to search every corner, every container, every possible hiding place where leavened products might be found. Miss even a crumb, and you'd violated the festival requirements. The penalty was being cut off from the people, a form of spiritual death that was worse than physical execution. The Day of Atonement required complete fasting from sunset to sunset. No food, no water, no work, no sexual relations. It was a day of complete self-denial, of spiritual focus so intense that any distraction could be fatal. The high priest entered the Holy of Holies only once a year, on this day, to make atonement for the sins of the entire nation. If he made a mistake, if he wasn't properly prepared, if he approached God incorrectly, he would die instantly. But the terror wasn't limited to the high priest. The entire nation's spiritual welfare hung in the balance. Everyone fasted, everyone prayed, everyone waited in terror to see if their representative would emerge alive from the most sacred place on earth. The collective held breath of an entire people, waiting to discover if their sins had been forgiven or if judgment was about to fall. The Feast of Tabernacles required you to build temporary shelters and live in them for a week. But these weren't camping trips. They were religious obligations with specific construction requirements. The materials had to be natural, the structure had to be temporary, the location had to be appropriate. Build your sukkah incorrectly, and you'd failed to observe the festival properly. And failure to observe the festivals wasn't just a personal problem, it was a community disaster. The festivals were collective observances that required everyone's participation. If enough people failed to comply, the entire community could face divine judgment. Your individual negligence could bring catastrophe upon your neighbors, your family, your entire tribe. The concept of corporate responsibility made every religious obligation a community concern. You weren't just responsible for your own spiritual welfare, you were responsible for everyone around you. If you saw someone violating God's laws and didn't confront them, you became complicit in their sin. If you remained silent when you should have spoken, you bore partial responsibility for the consequences that followed. This created a social environment that was simultaneously supportive and suffocating. Everyone was watching everyone else, not out of nosiness, but out of spiritual necessity. Your neighbor's sin could bring divine judgment upon your household. Your family member's rebellion could result in your entire lineage being cut off from the covenant community. The pressure to conform was overwhelming. Individual expression, personal preferences, creative innovation, all of these were potential sources of spiritual contamination. The safe path was to follow tradition exactly, to do what had always been done, to avoid any deviation from established patterns. Innovation was dangerous, creativity was suspect, and originality was often indistinguishable from rebellion. But even perfect conformity was no guarantee of safety. The story of Uzzah, struck dead for touching the Ark of the Covenant, shows how quickly good intentions could become capital offenses. He was trying to prevent the sacred chest from falling off a cart, trying to protect something holy from hitting the ground. His instinct was protective. His motivation was pure. His action was noble. It was also his last act. The message was unmistakable. Good intentions were irrelevant. The rules were absolute, and violation brought consequences regardless of motive. You couldn't claim ignorance as a defense, couldn't plead noble purpose as justification, couldn't argue that emergency circumstances suspended divine law. The law was the law, and death was the penalty for breaking it. This is what made the Old Testament world so uniquely terrifying. It wasn't just that the rules were strict, it was that they were incomprehensible. The logic behind many of the laws was never explained. The boundaries weren't always clear. The applications weren't always obvious. You could live your entire life trying to be righteous and still make the one mistake that would destroy you. The genealogies that modern readers find so tedious were actually matters of life and death. Your lineage determined your tribal affiliation, your inheritance rights, your marriage prospects, your social standing. But more than that, it determined your spiritual status. Some bloodlines were blessed, others were cursed. Some families were chosen for special roles, others were excluded from the congregation entirely. The descendants of Aaron could serve as priests, but only if they met specific physical requirements. Any defect, blindness, lameness, broken bones, excessive height or shortness, disqualified them from offering sacrifices. The descendants of Levi could serve in the temple, but only in subordinate roles. The line of David was promised the throne, but only if they remained faithful to the covenant. But the exclusions were even more specific. The descendants of illegitimate unions were forbidden from entering the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. The children of certain foreign marriages were permanently barred from the congregation. The offspring of incestuous relationships were cut off from the covenant community forever. And you had to prove your lineage. You had to be able to trace your ancestry back through the generations, documenting every marriage, every birth, every family connection. False claims about genealogy weren't just fraud, they were spiritual rebellion that could bring divine judgment upon your entire family line. The marriage laws were equally complex and equally crucial. You couldn't marry just anyone you loved. You had to marry within acceptable boundaries, avoiding relationships that God had forbidden. The prohibited degrees of consanguinity were extensive and specific. The restrictions on foreign marriages were absolute and non-negotiable. But the most terrifying aspect of Old Testament marriage law was the concept of spiritual contamination through association. Marry someone who worshipped foreign gods, and you'd be drawn into idolatry. Marry someone from a cursed lineage, and you'd contaminate your own bloodline. Marry someone who was ritually impure, and you'd absorb their spiritual pollution. The story of Phinehas illustrates how seriously God took these boundaries. When an Israelite man brought a Midianite woman into the camp, Phinehas didn't call for a trial or consult with the authorities. He took a spear and killed them both immediately, right there in the act of their transgression. His violent action ended a plague that had already killed 24,000 people. God's response was telling. He didn't condemn Phinehas for taking the law into his own hands. He didn't criticize him for acting without authorization. Instead, he rewarded him with a covenant of peace and eternal priesthood for his descendants. The message was clear. Some violations were so serious that immediate violent action was not only justified but required. This wasn't vigilante justice. It was divine approval of extreme measures to protect the community from spiritual contamination. The lesson was unmistakable. The purity of the covenant community was more important than individual rights, more valuable than personal relationships, more crucial than human life itself. The concept of the ban, or herem, extended this principle to entire populations. When God commanded the Israelites to destroy certain cities completely, he wasn't just ordering military victory, he was commanding spiritual purification through total annihilation. Every person, every animal, every possession was to be destroyed utterly, devoted to God through destruction. This wasn't about conquest or territorial expansion. It was about preventing contamination. The people of these cities were so spiritually corrupted, so morally polluted, that contact with them would inevitably lead to the contamination of God's chosen people. The only solution was complete elimination, total removal of the source of spiritual pollution. The cities of Canaan weren't just military targets. They were spiritual hazards that had to be neutralized before they could spread their contamination to the covenant community. Their gods were abominations. Their practices were detestable. Their very existence was a threat to the spiritual welfare of Israel. But the ban wasn't limited to foreign cities. It could be applied to Israelite communities that had become corrupted beyond redemption. Deuteronomy 13 describes the procedure for dealing with an Israelite city that had turned to idol worship. The entire population was to be killed. All their possessions were to be destroyed, and the city was to be burned completely. It was never to be rebuilt. The investigation process was thorough and terrifying. Witnesses had to be questioned, evidence had to be examined, the charges had to be proven beyond doubt. But once the investigation was complete, once the guilt was established, the sentence was absolute and irreversible. No appeals, no clemency, no opportunity for repentance, just total destruction. This is the world that would have tested every assumption you have about justice, mercy, and the value of human life. It was a world where spiritual purity was more important than physical survival, where collective welfare trumped individual rights, where the demands of holiness overrode the claims of humanity. The night grows deeper now, and the weight of these ancient realities settles around us like dust on forgotten altars. We've explored the surface dangers, the obvious pitfalls, the immediate threats that would face any modern person thrust into this unforgiving world. But we've only begun to understand the deeper currents that shaped every aspect of existence in the Old Testament. As your breathing slows and your thoughts begin to drift towards sleep, remember that in the world we're exploring, rest itself was a divine command that carried the death penalty for violation. The Sabbath wasn't just a day off, it was a test of faith, a demonstration of trust in God's provision, a weekly reminder that survival depended not on human effort, but on divine grace. The darkness gathers around us now like the shadow of ancient mountains, and in that darkness, we can almost hear the whispers of forgotten prayers, the echoes of sacrificial fires, the distant sound of stones falling upon condemned flesh. This is the world that shaped the foundation of Western civilization, the world that gave birth to concepts of law and justice that still influence us today. But it was also a world that would challenge every modern assumption about human dignity, individual rights, and the nature of divine love. A world where survival depended not on strength or intelligence, but on perfect obedience to laws that were absolute, mysterious, and utterly unforgiving. Sleep well, dear traveller, but know that tomorrow we'll continue our journey into this ancient realm, where the supernatural was ordinary, where the divine was dangerous, and where every sunrise brought fresh opportunities for both blessing and catastrophe. The Old Testament world awaits, patient and eternal, ready to test your faith, your courage, and your very understanding of what it means to be human in a universe governed by forces beyond mortal comprehension. Rest now. Let the ancient echoes fade to whispers. Let the weight of those impossible laws settle like dust on your shoulders. We've walked through the minefield of Old Testament existence, where every sunrise brought fresh opportunities for spiritual catastrophe, where every choice carried eternal consequences, where survival depended on navigating an intricate web of divine commands that could destroy you for the smallest misstep. The truth is, if you were dropped into that world tomorrow, you wouldn't last a day, not because you're weak or faithless, but because the Old Testament wasn't designed for survival. It was designed for testing. Every law, every ritual, every divine command was calibrated to separate the wheat from the chaff, to distinguish the truly faithful from the merely compliant, to reveal the contents of human hearts under the most extreme spiritual pressure imaginable. You would wake up in a world where the ground beneath your feet could open and swallow you whole for questioning authority, where the very air you breathed carried the possibility of divine judgment, where the food you ate, the clothes you wore, the words you spoke were all potential violations of laws you didn't know existed enforced by a God who saw everything and forgot nothing. The morning prayers wouldn't be optional meditations, they would be survival protocols. The dietary laws wouldn't be health suggestions, they would be matters of life and death. The ritual purity requirements wouldn't be ceremonial niceties, they would be the difference between belonging to the covenant community and being cut off from the only social structure that made existence possible. And through it all, you would carry the crushing knowledge that your individual fate was tied to the collective behavior of everyone around you. That your neighbor's sin could bring divine judgment upon your household. That your family member's rebellion could result in your entire lineage being erased from the covenant community. That the king's pride could trigger a plague that would kill thousands of innocent people. The psychological weight would be unbearable. The constant surveillance, the collective responsibility, the absolute nature of divine law, all of it would crush the spirit of anyone accustomed to individual freedom, personal privacy, and the luxury of making mistakes without cosmic consequences. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the Old Testament world was meant to be impossible, meant to demonstrate the gap between divine holiness and human frailty, meant to show that no amount of rule-following could bridge the chasm between God's perfect standards and humanity's imperfect nature. The heroes of these stories, Moses, David, Abraham, weren't successful because they were perfect. They were successful because they understood their imperfection and threw themselves on divine mercy. They recognized that survival in God's presence required not just obedience, but grace, not just following rules, but receiving favor that couldn't be earned. David, the man after God's own heart, was an adulterer and murderer. Moses, the greatest prophet in Israel's history, was a stuttering fugitive who killed an Egyptian in anger. Abraham, the father of faith, lied about his wife to save his own skin. These weren't perfect people. They were broken people who learned to trust in a God whose ways were higher than their ways, whose thoughts were beyond their understanding. The Old Testament world would have destroyed you, yes, but it would have destroyed you in order to rebuild you. It would have shattered your confidence in your own righteousness in order to teach you dependence on divine grace. It would have shown you the impossibility of earning God's favor in order to help you receive it as a gift. This is why the stories matter, why they've endured for thousands of years, why they continue to shape our understanding of justice, mercy, and the nature of divine love, not because they provide easy answers or comfortable solutions, but because they reveal the complexity of existence in a universe where holiness and humanity must somehow coexist. The night is deep now, and the ancient world fades back into the shadows where it belongs. The laws that once carried the death penalty are now historical curiosities. The rituals that once determined spiritual life and death are now academic subjects. The God who once consumed the disobedient with fire now invites the weary to find rest. But the lessons remain. The understanding that actions have consequences. The recognition that individual choices affect entire communities. The awareness that there are forces in the universe larger than human understanding. The humility that comes from recognizing our own limitations and the grace that comes from accepting help beyond ourselves. As you drift towards sleep, let these ancient truths settle into your consciousness, like sediment in still water. Let them remind you that the challenges you face, however difficult, are not insurmountable. Let them teach you that survival sometimes requires not just strength, but surrender. Not just effort, but acceptance. Not just doing, but being. The Old Testament world was unforgiving, yes, but it was also transformative. It broke people down in order to build them up. It destroyed illusions in order to reveal truth. It demanded everything in order to give back more than could be imagined. You wouldn't survive a day in that ancient world, but perhaps in trying to understand it, in wrestling with its impossible demands and terrible beauty, you might discover something about survival in this world. Something about the grace that meets us in our weakness, the mercy that finds us in our failure, the love that transforms us in our brokenness. The darkness is complete now, soft and welcoming. The ancient voices have fallen silent. The fires have burned low. The stones have stopped falling. Rest comes at last, not because you've earned it, but because it's been given. Sleep well, dear traveller. The morning will bring its own tests, its own challenges, its own opportunities for grace. But for now, in this quiet moment between the ancient world and the modern one, between the harsh light of divine judgment and the soft glow of divine love, there is peace. And perhaps that peace is what the Old Testament world was ultimately pointing toward. Not the peace of absence, but the peace of presence. Not the quiet that comes from avoiding conflict, but the stillness that comes from finding your place in the cosmic order. The peace that passes understanding, that transcends circumstances, that remains constant even when the ground beneath your feet is shifting. The ancient Israelites lived in a world where peace was temporary, where rest was regulated, where even sleep could be interrupted by divine visitation. But they also lived in a world where every sunrise was a reminder of God's faithfulness, where every successful harvest was evidence of divine provision, where every day of survival was a testimony to grace undeserved. They understood something we've forgotten in our modern comfort and security. They knew that life is fragile, that existence is precarious, that survival depends on forces beyond human control. They lived with the constant awareness that they were dependent creatures in a universe ruled by an independent God. This awareness shaped everything about their existence. It made them grateful for small mercies, thankful for temporary blessings, aware of the preciousness of each passing moment. They didn't take survival for granted because they understood how easily it could be taken away. They didn't assume tomorrow would come because they knew that tomorrow was a gift, not a guarantee. The harsh realities of Old Testament life forced them to confront ultimate questions that we prefer to avoid. What is the meaning of existence? What is the purpose of suffering? How should finite beings relate to infinite authority? What happens when human will conflicts with divine command? These weren't abstract theological questions for them. They were daily survival issues that determined whether you lived or died, whether you prospered or perished, whether you were included in the covenant community or cast out into the wilderness. The stakes were always ultimate, the consequences always final, the choices always eternal, and yet somehow they endured. Generation after generation, they passed down the stories, preserved the laws, maintained the rituals. They found ways to live with impossible standards, to function under crushing pressure, to maintain hope in the face of constant testing. They discovered that survival wasn't about being strong enough to meet God's demands, but about being broken enough to receive His mercy. The sacrificial system, for all its complexity and danger, pointed toward this truth. The animals that died on the altar weren't just paying for sin, they were demonstrating the cost of restoration. The blood that was spilled wasn't just ceremonial, it was evidence of the price required to bridge the gap between holiness and humanity. Every morning sacrifice was a reminder that life depended on death, that survival required substitution, that the only way to approach a perfect God was through a perfect offering. And since no human offering could ever be perfect enough, the system itself pointed beyond itself to something greater, something final, something that would satisfy divine justice once and for all. This is why the Old Testament world was so unforgiving. Not because God delighted in human suffering, but because He was preparing humanity for a solution that would address the root problem, rather than just treating the symptoms. The harsh realities of life under the law were designed to create a longing for something better, a hunger for grace that law could never provide. The prophets understood this. Their messages weren't just warnings about immediate consequences. They were promises about ultimate resolution. They spoke of a day when the law would be written on hearts instead of stones, when the Spirit would enable obedience instead of just demanding it, when the covenant would be renewed in a way that would make it unbreakable. Isaiah saw a time when the wolf would lie down with the lamb, when swords would be beaten into plowshares, when the knowledge of the Lord would cover the earth as the waters cover the sea. Jeremiah promised a new covenant that would be internalized rather than external, transformative rather than just regulatory. Ezekiel envisioned a new heart and a new spirit that would make obedience natural rather than forced. These weren't just poetic metaphors. They were practical promises about a different kind of existence. An existence where survival wouldn't depend on perfect rule following, where security wouldn't require constant vigilance, where peace wouldn't be temporary but permanent. The Old Testament world was hard because it was incomplete. It was a preview, not the final performance. It was a shadow, not the substance. It was a preparation, not the fulfillment. Every impossible law, every harsh judgment, every crushing responsibility was pointing toward the need for something better, something that would satisfy divine justice while providing human mercy. This is what makes the Old Testament stories so compelling and so troubling. They reveal both the majesty and the terror of existence in a universe governed by absolute moral law. They show us what we're capable of at our worst and what we're called to at our best. They demonstrate both the necessity of justice and the impossibility of achieving it through human effort alone. The night deepens around us now, and these ancient truths settle into our consciousness like stars emerging in a darkening sky. We've walked through the valley of the shadow of death that was Old Testament existence, where survival was never guaranteed and safety was never certain. We've seen the crushing weight of divine law, the terror of divine judgment, the impossibility of divine standards. But we've also glimpsed something else, the hint of a different way, a better path, a solution that addresses the root problem rather than just managing the symptoms. The promise that the harsh realities of the Old Testament world were not the final word, but the first word in a longer conversation about justice and mercy, law and grace, human need and divine provision. As you drift towards sleep, let these ancient voices fade to whispers. Let the weight of those impossible laws settle like dust on forgotten altars. Remember that you wouldn't survive a day in that world, but remember also that you were never meant to. That world was designed to break human pride, to shatter human confidence, to reveal human need for something beyond human capability. The darkness is complete now, soft and welcoming. The ancient fires have burned low. The stones have stopped falling. The harsh voices of judgment have given way to gentle whispers of mercy. Rest comes at last, not because you've earned it, but because it's been given freely, graciously, without regard for your ability to deserve it. Sleep well, dear traveller. The morning will bring its own challenges, its own opportunities, its own reminders of grace. But for now, in this quiet moment between the ancient world and the modern one, between the harsh light of perfect law and the gentle glow of perfect love, there is peace. Deep, abiding, unshakable peace. The Old Testament world was unforgiving because it was honest. It told the truth about human nature, about divine holiness, about the gap between what we are and what we're called to be. It didn't offer easy answers or comfortable solutions. It simply revealed the problem in all its complexity and pointed toward the hope of a solution that would one day make all things new. And in that hope, in that promise, in that glimpse of something better, we find the peace that passes understanding, not the peace of those who have conquered, but the peace of those who have surrendered, not the peace of those who have achieved, but the peace of those who have received, the peace that comes not from being strong enough to survive, but from being loved enough to be saved. Rest now. The ancient world has spoken its truth. The modern world awaits with its own challenges and its own graces. But for now, in this timeless moment between sleeping and waking, between memory and hope, between law and grace, there is peace. And peace, after all, is what the human heart has always been searching for.